this room and everybody who watches this video knows how I feel about this shit. Yeah, I hate it.
From the UFC finally being held accountable for underpaying its fighters to preventing fighters from making money from other organizations. This is why the UFC is in big trouble, starting with the legal drama that's been cooking against the UFC. Apparently, there's a $5 billion lawsuit against the UFC. They straight up labeled the UFC's contracts as ruthless and coercive, accused them of squashing fighter pay, and even slapped them with the anti-competitive conduct tag. Now, the UFC's bigwigs weren't just sitting around, so they called this case nonsense, but the judge wasn't buying it. They even tried to get a quick win through something called summary judgment, essentially asking for a decision without a full trial, but the judge didn't bite. Their last-ditch effort was to contest the plaintiff's class status in a move to keep the lawsuit going, and the judge gave it the green light. The UFC is kind of running out of tricks now, because after almost a decade of legal back and forth, it seems like this lawsuit might finally be coming to an end. The fighters were basically aiming for two categories. First, they were gunning for everyone who stepped into the UFC ring between late 2010 and mid-2017, because that's the timeline that's under the microscope here. Then there was the second category, where fighters whose names got used during that same period. They managed to secure the first category, the fighting class, but got a thumbs down for the second. The big deal here is that first class, though. While it might not be the exact slam dunk they were hoping for, it's still a win for the fighters. This green light means the plaintiffs can now go after class damages. So if they win, over 1,200 fighters ticking those boxes could be in for some sweet compensation. And the judge also asked them to seek injunctive relief. Now, if injunctive relief is given the green light, it could potentially force the UFC to do a U-turn on their business practices based on what the court officially dishes out. We're talking about contract limits that could cap off at 1 to 3 years without any extensions. And they might even throw in some extra clauses for good measure. Looking ahead within the next 1 to 7 years, the UFC's plea to toss out the class certification could either get a boot or be kicked out of court altogether. That'd clear the runway for the case to really take off, and what's waiting down the road is a good old trial. But don't go banking on a settlement just yet, because this is a big antitrust lawsuit we're dealing with. If things swing in favor of the fighters, they could be in for a sweet deal which could triple their financial victory, possibly even hitting the $5 billion altogether. And those injunctions could put the UFC in trouble. Honestly, just getting to this stage is already a big win. The UFC has made some changes to their contracts thanks to this legal tangle, like the sunset clause. So, in a way, the fighters have already won. But if they win this case, if it ever goes to trial, we're talking some serious moolah, possibly hundreds of millions. Now, the UFC has been the big shot in MMA for quite a few decades now, thanks to fighters like Ronda Rousey and Conor McGregor, who've become massive stars, but also because of Dana White steering the ship. Sure, there are other organizations like Bellator and One Championship around, but let's be real, none even come close to giving UFC a run for its money. They're pretty much running the show in the MMA department, but for how long? Well, this lawsuit could probably change that. And this isn't even the only time the UFC's been in trouble, because they got into another mess in 2022. Apparently, a former UFC fighter bet against his own fighters and his own team, and he probably would have made a killing if things went as planned. Dana White and his crew initially brushed this off like it's just a couple of bad apples, but now he's sounding the alarm about fight fixing and saying that it's a big concern for the company. He's even throwing around the idea that fighters caught up in this mess could end up behind bars. The whole problem is their business model, which looks all fancy from the outside, but in reality is putting some crazy restrictions on fighters who are struggling to make ends meet while UFC's getting all the dough. James Krause's story is a prime example of the corruption going on within the UFC, driven by their hunger for profits. He's been on the UFC scene since 2013. Sure, he wasn't exactly Mr. Consistency as a fighter, but he held his own in the octagon. He managed to get 9 wins out of 13 fights, which isn't too shabby. But like many other MMA fighters, he had to deal with scraping by on a tiny paycheck, while the UFC rolls in cash. When we break it down, most of the chatter in the MMA community has been circling around the glaring signs in Krause's public statements. And the UFC? Well, they've been getting an earful too for not slamming the brakes on betting until mid-October. That's just 3 weeks before the Minor Showdown. And let's not forget the finger-pointing at their reckless dash with sportsbook partnerships, all without making sure the whole betting scene is playing fair. But these problems didn't just drop out of the sky. Back in 2018, the Supreme Court gave the nod to sports gambling in the U.S. How? By tossing the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act out the window. From then on, the UFC cozied up to big names like DraftKings and Stake, slapping betting ads all over their broadcasts. It was their way of pumping up the cash flow from short-term sponsorships and boosting those TV ratings. The timing couldn't have been better, right in sync with the first COVID-19 lockdowns in 2020. While other sports were taking hits, the UFC managed to keep their live events rolling, pulling in massive numbers, and this included problem gamblers who were left high and dry without their usual basketball, baseball, and football bets to make. If we dissect everything one by one, we're just skimming the surface of the UFC's potential dance with fight fixing. To really get the full scoop, we've got to take a deep dive into their political economy and the whole grand setup of money and politics that's driving this ship. Because the thing is, ever since Endeavor swooped in and bought the UFC around 2016, they've been pocketing around 80 to 85% of the total revenue. What's left? Well, that's what's supposed to make its way to the fighters. According to the numbers, the UFC raked in an insane $1.14 billion in 2022. Out of that, only $176.6 million ended up being divided among all 700 fighters who battled it out in the octagon that year. Now, the big bucks head straight to superstars like Conor McGregor, and just below them, you've got a neat little bunch of fighters who managed to keep a somewhat stable income over their time in the game. But then there's the fresh crop of fighters who kick off their careers with a basic $10,000 per fight before taxes. And for the most part, the fighters in this third group aren't even breaking even. After cutting their taxes, management, and coaching fees, many are forced to clock in at second jobs just to make ends meet. Just for perspective, the CEO of Endeavor hauled in a whopping $300 million in 2021. That's just ruthless. And they even forbid the fighters from working with other organizations, with restrictions stretching to boxing, kickboxing, and pro wrestling. So, from preventing fighters from making money from other organizations to the UFC finally being held accountable for underpaying its fighters, this was why the UFC is in big trouble.